next literary time period that we're going to be looking at is the medieval period. And technically the Anglo-Saxon period belongs to the medieval period, but because it's so specific, I want to look at it separately. So we're looking at 476 AD to 1500 AD, so another huge time period. And in this, we're going to mostly be looking at a couple different types of writing. So we still have the epic, so long poems about heroic events, very exaggerated. And then we're going to have the lyric poem, which are meant to be sung, just as the epics are being recited. The lyrics are meant to be sung, and they're meant to be tales of love and tales of just moral dilemmas, things like that. And then we start to deal with narrative. So we have the beginning of the novel coming up. We don't have a classic novel in that sense, but we have people starting to write more, and mostly just because we have writing now. Before that, we didn't have a lot of writing in Europe. So we're learning how to write, and we're writing things down, and we're starting to explore the paragraph form. The other thing that they had a lot of is plays. So plays too can go around traveling and having people act things out and only memorize certain lines, and so they become very popular. However, they're not plays like the plays that we have now. They have 4 different types of plays that they focus on. The miracle play, which deals with biblical miracles. We'll talk more about Christianity in a minute. The mystery plays, which are not mysteries in the sense of how we think of mystery now. It's along the same idea as the miracle plays, but they're things that human beings can't comprehend, so they're more philosophical. The moral plays, where we're supposed to get a moral out of what we see, and the passion plays, which are showing devotion, and again, it's not really what we'd consider to be passion that way, but we're dealing with these very religious ideas. And normally they would come and set up in a town, and you could go from stage to stage and watch all of them, or you might even travel down the street with the play. It's kind of an immersive experience, which is again very different than what we have now. Another thing that you're going to see kind of in that narrative view is we're going to start to have fables. So fables usually involve animals, and they have that moral, the tortoise and the hare story, or the crow with the stones, those type of things that we're learning through these stories. The biggest thing about the medieval period in general is that we're really pushing Christianity in the form primarily of Catholicism, and we have things like the Crusades and very anti anything that isn't Christian. So we're starting to push those things out and focus on Christianity, and I don't even know how to begin to cover the Crusades, but you're going to see people in these stories who have been on crusade, and so they're literally going to places and killing people in an attempt to convert them from being Muslim or another pagan religion to Christianity, which again is Catholicism more so than like early church Christianity. Other things that we should know, so that covers our structural things. As far as literary devices go, allegory is the big one. Allegory is when everything in a story represents something else. So a really good example of this from later is Pilgrim's Progress, where every obstacle he faces, everything that happens is quite literally something that it's representing. So He's pilgrim, which means someone who's on a journey, and he runs into things like sloth and which is laziness, and just goes through his progression, but everything's like named after what it's being. Usually it's not as obvious as that. Normally we have to work a little harder to find the allegory. But the difference between that and symbolism is that everything one-to-one represents something else, and it should be made pretty obvious. The other thing you're going to see literary device-wise is just symbols in general. So we have Catholicism is very much, or early Catholicism is infatuated by the saints, and they have relics, and those relics are tied to saints. So it might be like Peter's blanket and Mary's dress. Those are not real examples, but they're things that you could buy or pray over to have kind of good fortune come to you. And that kind of leads us easily into dealing with symbolism and objects representing other things. It is important to note when it comes to authors that almost everything from this time period is anonymous, and that's because if you happen to say the wrong thing, the Crusades are happening and people are being burned as witches, and we have definitely extreme consequences for making people angry. So you do not want to make people angry, and so you're going to publish things anonymously, either because you're saying something that might make someone angry, or you're just, covering all bases, making sure that you're all set. End of the medieval period, we're introduced to Chaucer, who we're going to be looking at primarily. He does put his name out there, which is very, very courageous of him, because he has very strong critiques of the Catholic Church. And again, I keep making this distinction just because all of these things are different than they are now. So Christianity looks different, Catholicism looks different. We're in a very extreme time where we bring missionaries and stuff in, and there's a whole lot of corruption. There are people who are just letting people pay them off. The whole Crusades thing anyway, you could get a pardon from the Pope to go do terrible things, and then you just pay money and your soul is clean again. We'd have poor people who are paying money to touch relics that are not real. And Chaucer brings all of this to the forefront. And he has people who are truly religious and are good examples of what Christianity and Catholicism should be. But all of his high up officials are very corrupt and selfish and only are in it for money, things like that. And so he publishes this, and that brings us to the third literary device, which is satire. So satire is when you are making fun of something. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. It could be a parody where you're quite literally writing in the same style. So he has his people in the Canterbury Tales going on pilgrimage. And so normally that's a deeply religious event, but the people who are going on it are very corrupt. So he's parodying that. It could be Juvenalian satire, which is just like in your face, kind of sarcastic and, I don't know, just kind of joking about things or being overly aggressive. We're going to see examples of this later. And then there's more just like subtle satire. But yeah. The other thing I want to talk about for the rest of the time is the idea of knights and ladies and chivalry and our class system. So it's very important to understand that there's a strong class system happening in England during the later parts of this, which is that you have a king, he has dukes and people like that hang out at court, and then they have homes that they don't spend that much time in. They have homes, and at those homes there are villages, towns, etc. with poorer people. And you're kind of in charge of making sure your poor people do the things that they're supposed to. So the serfs have their kind of ruler who is the lord or lady of their particular place in the world. But like if the king was going to war, he would call on all of his men, and then they would call on all of their men that are essentially slaves in some ways, but they get away with it in that it's like, oh yes, like you have your house and you're in charge of that, but every profit you make, you have to give so much to your landlord. And so that's how they create this class system all the way up. Women have a confusing place in that. Like there are eventually, after this time, women who rule, but up to that point they're kind of just like a figurehead. But you do have women who are in the Crusades. You have a lot of women who are being killed for being witches. It's also important to understand that a lot of doctors were killed for being warlocks or witches. So if you were in good graces with the king or queen and you're like healing their sick child, then we love you. But as soon as the child dies, well, you're a witch. So that's how that works. But the knights and ladies are a romanticized idea of this loyalty to the king at all costs, that he matters more to you than your own father does, and that you're kind of in love with the virtue of all women. So you are taking like tokens and favors from these women and going out and winning battles for them. But there's still that moral dilemma. So we have like King Arthur and Guinevere, but then we have Lancelot, and Lancelot is in love with Guinevere, and he's not supposed to be in love with her, and so you have that. But the big word you need is chivalry. So chivalry is the main idea during this time, and then Chaucer picks those things apart as well, with some of his stories of having knights do very ungentlemanly things. During this time, it's also important, even if you're not a knight, to be a gentleman, and to be caring for and loving your wife. So you should they set up these Christian home values, and that's what we work off moving forward. So a lot of, just like we have references back to the Greeks and Romans, we will also have references back to this time period, because people are infatuated with this sense of, I don't know, it's nice to think that everything works out for people, that the king really has everyone's best interest in mind, and the knights are making sure it happens, and all the ladies are cared for, and we make sure that nothing bad happens to them. And in theory it sounds really nice, even though it's kind of a big time of trying to bolster their image, because like I said, I wasn't going to get too much into the Crusades, but as we go on the Crusades, we run into cultures that are more advanced when it comes to science and math and things like that, but we're just like, no, that needs to go away. We just need to be kind to people, which is very ironic. And yeah, so that's the medieval period.